we have seen a rising cynicism, driven by events both inside as well as outside of the Parliament's chamber. And so we are extremely fortunate tonight that we have David McGill with us to deliver this year's Donald Dewar Memorial Lecture. David joined the Scottish Parliament at its very beginning and has served in many roles over the years, from committee clerk to private principal secretary to the presiding officer. In 2019, he was appointed the Parliament's clerk and chief executive. In that role, he is responsible, and this is a long list, for managing the Parliament's staff, property, services, and finances. He acts as the principal advisor to the presiding officer. He chairs the senior executive team and attends meetings of the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body. And he has lead responsibility for the Parliament's responses to constitutional issues, amongst many other elements, but we'll just leave it at that. In short, he knows the place pretty well by this point, and he's very well positioned to reflect on the development of the Parliament in light of its original principles and objectives. Before I hand over to David, I must note a few basic housekeeping matters. As usual, we're recording tonight's lecture and we'll make it available on our website, which you can find by Googling Stevenson Trust, University of Glasgow. We'll encourage anyone interested in public affairs and citizenship to visit our archive of past Stevenson lectures. Also, we now have a YouTube channel, apparently, thanks to Connor. And we particularly encourage educators to look at our lectures and get in touch if we can offer support in any way. Please be aware that if you choose to ask a question during the Q&A session, we take your participation as consent of being included in the recording. And finally, you'll be pleased to hear that there is no fire alarm scheduled for this evening. So in the event of a fire alarm sounding, we got to get out. So out through the way that you came in, and then to the main flagpole through the quad. With all that out of the way, I am very pleased to turn over the podium in this very sort of number 10-esque kind of lectern to David McGill for tonight's Dewar Memorial Lecture. David.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for that introduction. It's a real pleasure for me to be here tonight and a real honour to deliver this Donald Dewar Memorial Lecture. First, before I get started, just a little word about me and the role that I occupy as Clerk of the Parliament. As you've just heard, since 2019, I've had the privilege of leading the parliamentary staff as the Clerk and Chief Executive, and I just wanted to pause on that title. There's two quite distinct roles. First, as Clerk of the Parliament, which is a statutory role, as Chris has said, responsibility for being the Chief Political and Procedural Advisor to presiding officers and to others. Chief Executive role, as you would expect, the same as Chief Executive of other organisations. At Westminster, the roles are split, but in the Scottish Parliament, because of scale, it makes sense for the two roles to sit together. In addition to those roles, also Accountable Officer for the Scottish Parliament's Budget and Resources and Head of the Parliamentary Service. And on that particular role, I just wanted to say that it sometimes surprises people to learn that we're not civil servants. I'm sure that's not the case for this audience. But civil servants are obviously there to deliver the policy priorities of the government of the day. Parliamentary staff are there to manage the scrutiny of those policies, so it would be inappropriate for us to be civil servants. Our job is to make sure that the government is held to account. So we're there to serve all members of all parties and none equally and impartially. And it's that impartiality that runs through everything we do, and it's been central to my working life since 1999. Unlike others who've delivered this lecture, I did not know Donald Dewar. At the Parliament's first and temporary home on the Mound in Edinburgh, a few months before he died, he held the door open for me. I said thank you, he said you're welcome. That's the only time we ever spoke to each other. But I was there when the Parliament was established and when Donald made his landmark speech in front of the Queen at the opening of the Parliament. And I've been there ever since, watching the Parliament that he worked so hard to deliver, develop and evolve and grow. So in offering my reflections this evening, I'd like to ask the question, what would Donald Dewar have approved of what the Parliament has become 26 years on from that landmark speech at the formal opening in July 1999? I should start by stating the obvious, there's no way of knowing. And I realise that gives me a massive get out for everything else that I'm going to say this evening. But I do believe there are some clues in what Donald said and what he left us with that I'm going to try and use to answer this question. So Donald Dewar, as the then Secretary of State for Scotland, established the Consultative Steering Group in November of 1997, just as the Scotland Bill was being introduced at the Westminster Parliament. And the job of that steering group was to consider and make recommendations on how the Parliament should work. The group was made up of a mix of politicians and civic society leaders, and importantly, it was chaired by the then Scottish Office Minister and Donald's immediate successor as First Minister, Henry McLeish. Donald also appointed Jim Wallace, who of course became his Deputy First Minister. So Donald was closely associated with the establishment and the membership and the influence that the CSG brought to the Parliament's proceedings. As an aside, another member of that group was George Reid. George Reid once told me a story about Donald Dewar, and this was one of the very first things that the Parliament did when it was established in 1999. It elected presiding officers and deputy presiding officers, and almost uniquely amongst the parliamentary decision-making process, those decisions are by secret ballot. So there's lots of milling about as members queue up at ballot boxes and chat to each other as the vote is being undertaken. So George told me that having just missed out on the election of the first presiding officer, which went to David Steele, Donald Dewar made his way over as the vote was running for deputy presiding officer and just quietly, without saying anything, stood beside George. And George took that as a sign to people in the chamber that he supported George's inclusion in that first presiding officer team. And he took that as a real sign that that Donald was really serious about this being an inclusive parliament that represented different political views. So a few short weeks after that, I sat in the chamber of the Parliament when Donald made that landmark speech. Some consider it to be his finest speech. He rose to the occasion that was warranted for such a historic event. And he talked about it being a rare privilege in an old parliament, in an old nation, to open a new parliament. He talked of there being a new voice in the land and it being a day when democracy was renewed in Scotland. And those three passages in particular have really stuck with me over the intervening years. It's an odd thing to say, but all of those years later, it still feels sometimes like it's a new voice in the land. So that speech, which is often referred to and often quoted, was less than 5 minutes long, but it did set the tone for those early days, and to me it still echoes down a quarter century of devolved government in Scotland, and it's often held up as hitting exactly the right note for that time in the Parliament's life. So to try and answer that question that I've just posed, I'm going to cover the extent to which the Parliament's founding principles have been realised against a backdrop of significant change at governmental, constitutional, structural level. Whether, as Donald said, the Parliament became the place where big ideas have been tested. A look at some recent innovations on engagement and deliberative democracy, where weaknesses remain and more reform is still required. And finally, I want to return to that central question of whether Donald Dewar would have approved of what the Parliament has become. I'm not sure that the... Thank you. So in 1999, the Consultative Steering Group, which I'll call the CSG from now on, published its report which set out the aspirations and recommendations for the Scottish Parliament and was used as a blueprint for how the Parliament would work as well as containing the framework for the Parliament's rules of procedures and standing orders. The CSG most notably bequeathed the Parliament with a set of founding principles. And you can see them there, I won't read those out in turn. These principles still govern a lot of what we do, and we refer to them almost on a weekly basis. So the yardstick by which we test ourselves, whether we're living up to those founding principles. The quote that I'm sure you'll all have heard, that devolution is a process and not an event, is often attributed to Donald Dewar. It was in fact said by Ron Davies, who was the Secretary of State for Wales, so Donald's parallel in Wales. But Donald Dewar did say in 1999 that 1999 marked a new stage in a journey begun long ago and which has no end. So there's clear connections between those two statements, but I always find Donald's just that bit more plain speaking and more accessible. Of course, the world has changed beyond all recognition since then. There's been all of the changes at those different levels that I referred to, and I now want to deal with each of those in turn. So at the governmental level, it's worth recapping on the different governments that we've had since 1999. First, we had the two Labour Liberal Democrat coalitions for the first 8 years of the Parliament's life. They came with them a parliamentary majority built in, albeit in the second of those periods it was a bit tighter than it had been in the first, but clearly a working majority for the government. We then jumped to a minority SNP government. They were a good 20 seats short of a working majority, but they decided to run that parliament with a minority government, and they got through so much business and were seen to be running things competently. But I think that by the time it got to 2016, that was one of the factors. When we got to 2011, that was one of the factors in them delivering a single-party majority government, which is something that we were told up until then wasn't going to be a possibility. 2016, very, very close to a majority, but slipping back into minority. And then in 2021, lost a few more seats, but still not too far short of a majority on its own. And during this session, we had that initial minority position. Then we had the Butte House Agreement, which was a cooperation agreement with the Scottish Green parties, short of a full formal coalition. That came to an end early last year, and now we're back into that minority position. Looking ahead to the election that we've got coming in less than 6 months now, like everyone else, I don't know what the government makeup will be. We're too far out to make any certain predictions there. But I think one thing we can be pretty sure of is we're going to have a lot of new members. Previously, elections were turned over round about 50, as high as 50 members out of the 129. I think this time round we're looking at record turnovers. Given the numbers that we know we're going to stand down, we're standing at 39 at the moment, as well as the rise of new parties. I think we are looking at that record number the next time. This can cause challenges, but it's also a good opportunity to get the Parliament off to a good start. And my colleague Alan Campbell will be leading a lecture on this very topic in March, so just about a couple of months short of that election. Those different governments, the reason I've mentioned them is that they have an impact on how the Parliament operates and how the institution behaves, especially with regard to the management of parliamentary business. The composition of the government, most importantly how it uses the size of its voting bloc, can determine a lot about how a session runs. In very general terms, although this isn't always the case, a weaker government can mean a stronger Parliament. So there's a direct correlation between the two. I think this can be borne out by, for example, the Parliamentary Bureau, which is the body, cross-party body consisting of business managers, party whips. A party has to have at least 5 members before it gets a seat on the Parliamentary Bureau. They carry that number of votes round the Bureau table. Interestingly, this session, because until pretty recently the 4 Liberal Democrats weren't represented round about that table, presiding officer's vote doesn't count around that table either. The government had a majority in the Bureau, so it had the ability to drive through decisions of the Bureau, but almost everything the Bureau does needs to be ratified by the Chamber. It didn't have a majority in the Chamber, so it had to be very careful about how it used its position in the Parliamentary Bureau, so it was still having to negotiate and collaborate, even though in that setting it did have that parliamentary majority. We also find when we have minority governments there can be a lot more negotiations over policy proposals. I think the biggest example of this probably is with that 27 minority government that was so far short of a parliamentary majority. The SNP at that time had some very clear manifesto commitments that it just couldn't deliver on. It couldn't look around the chamber and think, if we work with that party, we can deliver this one. So the manifesto pledged to deliver reform of council tax. SNP were quite upfront about that. We don't have a parliamentary majority, so we're going to drop that. And also we see with legislation an increase in amendments to bills as they're going through the amending stages. We see a lot more of that coming from opposition parties because they know there's a greater opportunity for them to be passed. So running alongside all of those changes at the government level, there's been a whole number of constitutional changes. First, I would pick out the Calman Commission, chaired by Professor Sir Kenneth Calman, who of course was Chancellor of this very university at the time. Interestingly, that was set up by a parliamentary motion proposed by the opposition Labour Party in 2007, and it was opposed by the SNP who were in government. So I think that goes back to what we're saying about this being something that the government didn't have the parliamentary majority to prevent happening, even though they would have liked that to be the case. So it produced its final report in 2009, included a wide range of proposals around revenue raising, borrowing powers, joint working between administrations and so on. As that could only be delivered by a change to the 1999 Scotland Act, the original act, that had to be Westminster legislation. There was a change in the Westminster legislation from a Labour government to a Conservative-led coalition before the bill was introduced at Westminster, but that Conservative-led government agreed to introduce the bill, which ultimately led to the 2012 Scotland Act, the key features of which were raising or lowering income tax by 10 pence in the pound across all bands, which has never been used, devolution of stamp duty, which has become land and building transaction tax, and the introduction of borrowing powers, the creation of Revenue Scotland to collect and manage Scotland's devolved taxes. So remembering that the SNP opposed the establishment of the committee at the Commission at the outset, but they ultimately agreed to that bill's passage through the legislative consent process. So next we had the Smith Commission, which you may recall was set up the day after the independence referendum. This was designed to deliver the famous vow that was inspired by Gordon Brown. So it was announced on the 19th of September. Unlike the Calman Commission, it did have memberships and representatives of all the political parties, including the SNP and the independent supporting Greens. It worked at pace, and I was surprised to remind myself that it delivered its recommendations a little over 2 months after that independence referendum. The report had a wide range of recommendations, again, including complete power over non-savings and non-dividend income tax, assignation of VAT, which has never been delivered, devolution of a number of social security benefits, management of the Crown Estate's assets in Scotland, and the power to extend the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds for Scottish elections, as had been the case for the independence referendum. So similar to the Calman Commission, again, there was a UK election before the bill to deliver these recommendations could be introduced. SNP won overwhelmingly in Scotland. Conservatives won a majority across the UK. After the election, SNP said its view was that these reforms still didn't go far enough, but the UK pressed ahead with the bill, and the Scotland Act of 2016 implemented the Commission's proposals. And finally, on this topic, of course, the Brexit referendum in 2016. I think it's fair to say that UK's exit from the European Union has been the biggest constitutional change since 1999 and probably since the UK joined the EU in the first place. The Parliament's Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture Committee, which I'm just going to call the committee from now on, has identified a number of fundamental challenges for devolution and is of the view that the devolution looks very different outside of the EU compared to when the UK was a member state. And the committee's view is that there remains a risk that the Scottish Parliament's core functions are diluted as a result of Brexit. These changes aren't changes to the Parliament's legislative competence like the 2012 and 2016 Act. They're more incremental adjustments through UK primary legislation and executive action. So because of that, they're arguably more challenging to navigate than a clear transfer of responsibilities. The Sewell Convention, which since 1999 has stated that the UK Parliament will not normally legislate in devolved areas without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, has been under strain in that time. And the committee has also expressed deep concern about the fact that more decisions are being taken at the intergovernmental level since Brexit, creating challenges for transparency and for the Scottish Parliament's ability to hold these decision makers to account. Legislation at Westminster since 2016, including without the consent of the Parliament, has increasingly given the UK government powers to act in devolved areas. Taken together, these changes post-EU exit have fundamentally shifted the framework within which devolution operates, and the result for the Parliament is a significant risk of diluted scrutiny, a legislative role, and, as I said, challenges with the transparency of executive decision-making. So as well as the Constitution Committee being active in highlighting these areas, our Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has also been raising concerns about UK ministers taking and exercising delegated powers in devolved areas. And at the UK Parliament level, the House of Lords Constitution Committee has also raised concerns, and it's called for a review of intergovernmental relations and the Sewell Convention, development of a set of criteria on the appropriate use of delegated powers in areas of devolved competence, and an increase in devolution capacity in each UK government department. So all of these issues that I've spoken about are challenging for the Parliament as an institution, but they're also politically difficult to manage because increasingly they can't be separated out from the political views of the parties, which are more seen as being pro-union, pro-independence. So the result is very much a fractured political consensus, which leaves the Parliament as an institution potentially overexposed in these shifting political sands. So what are we doing about it? Well, there is a recognition that there's a need to ensure that members are able to understand this and effectively scrutinise this increasingly complex devolution landscape. And this is only going to be more of a challenge given that we're just about to welcome that large swathe of new members that I referred to earlier. There's also work going alongside that in order to ensure that we have a capable parliamentary service that's able to support scrutiny of this increasingly complex landscape. So the final area of change that we've had since 1999 is structural change, running alongside that governmental change and constitutional change. And there's a few things I would pick out here. In the first 3 sessions of the Parliament, we were working with 4-year sessions. In 2012, that changed with the consensus of the political parties in the Parliament at the time to 5-year sessions. And that change was decided on in order to give incumbent governments a bit more time to deliver their legislative priorities and see them through to outcomes. It's interesting to note that after the May elections that we have in Scotland and Wales, that the Senedd in Wales will revert to 4-year sessions after going through the same process as the Scottish Parliament. My own view is that I was always very clear that the 4-year sessions, there's a lot of time lost at the beginning and end, a lot of time in setting up for a new session, welcoming new members, making sure that they're able to fulfil their legislative and scrutiny representative roles. And then towards the end, there's lots of time, there's lots of focus on the upcoming election. So I was very much in favour of 5-year sessions. Now I'm not so sure. People get very, very tired. Governments get very tired. Members get very tired. And I can understand why Cardiff is moving back to that 4-year session, but I'm just not quite sure what the right answer is. On the sitting pattern that the Parliament undertakes, it was originally the case that committees would sit, the Parliament sits Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in general. It was originally the case that the Parliament's committees would meet on all day Tuesday, Wednesday mornings, and then the Parliament would meet in plenary Wednesday afternoons and all day Thursday. The fourth presiding officer, Trisha Marwick, was very concerned that this meant that there was a big gap between the Parliament rising at 5 o'clock, say on a Thursday, and not sitting again until 2 o'clock on a Wednesday. So she pushed through changes that meant that the Parliament would sit on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday afternoons, and committees would meet on those mornings, and that's the pattern that we still follow today. Linked with that, and to meet her concern about that lack of ability for the Parliament to do anything from Thursday afternoon to a Wednesday afternoon, the Parliament introduced topical questions. So the first item of business on a Tuesday afternoon are questions on issues that have arisen since the Parliament last rose to try and make the Parliament more responsive. So government ministers can be called in at very short notice, 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, to answer questions on something that may have arisen just the previous day. So building on the success of those topical questions and trying to make the chamber a bit more relevant was another change to the introduction of urgent questions. We've always had emergency questions, but the barrier for them was seen to be really quite high. There needed to be some sort of catastrophe before an urgent question would be selected. So the Commission on Parliamentary Reform, which was established by our fifth presiding officer, Ken McIntosh, and reported in 2017, addressed this issue of emergency questions being used so sparingly by the introduction of urgent questions. And again, the purpose was just to make sure that the Parliament could be that bit more responsive to developments and emerging events. So members can now table questions up to 10 o'clock in the morning that could be taken just a few hours later. And again, the government needs to respond to those questions. Having said all of that, the current presiding officer would like us to go further. She's still not convinced that the Parliament is as responsive to the developments as we should be. So that's something that she's in active discussion with our Procedures Committee on. One of her other priorities has been around equal representation and participation for women in the work of the Parliament. So to that end, she launched a gender-sensitive audit earlier this session, which produced a range of recommendations for how Parliament should change its rules, practices and culture. We've implemented more than half of those recommendations now, including things like proxy voting, gathering and publishing lots of data on gender issues, and producing best practice guidance for committees. So we're still carefully working our way through those changes around about membership of committees, the Bureau and so on. So finally here, one of the things that I'd like to cover a bit more in detail later is the Procedures Committee's recent report on the effectiveness of parliamentary committees, and this could lead to some significant structural changes for next session. So against the backdrop of this constant changing environment, working with Ken McIntosh, one of the things I did as the Parliament approached its 20th anniversary was to invite the original members of the CSG to come back in, spend a day with us, and ask themselves whether we'd met their aspirations when they produced their original report in 1998. So 9 of those 13 members were able to join us, and they went through a long process of analysing what they thought in 1999, looking at the reality in 2019 and seeing how the two things matched up. Their report recognised some of the huge changes that I've just talked about. They also added into that financial constraints, which weren't the case when the Parliament was established, more polarised politics. They also recognised huge changes in technology and social media, which of course we all know have changed again since that commission reported 6 years ago. So they saw a lot of positives when they did their review of devolution at 20. They referenced some what they called world-class legislation and concluded that Parliament had more than vindicated the case for a legislature in Scotland. They therefore said that their analysis started from a very positive place. But on a less positive note, they expressed their disappointment in what they saw as much more in the way of political tribalism than they had expected in 1998. And they concluded that their vision of breaking that confrontational mould at Westminster had not been met. The main finding was that the mechanisms they had recommended to achieve more of a consensus approach to policy development had not been used, and that tribalism had dented the Parliament's scrutiny function. As an aside, when that CSG, that reformed CSG, was finalising its report, it was doing so at the same time as the UK was finalising its exit from the European Union. The CSG recognised that, but they actually thought that would strengthen collaboration between the two governments by the creation of shared policy spaces in which the two governments would have to collaborate. In practice, that has proven to be a bit of a bone of contention, with many, including, as we've seen, parliamentary committees across the UK, seeing successive UK governments as retaining too many of the return powers at a UK level, and the Internal Markets Act acting in a way that cuts across devolved decision making. So turning to parliamentary committees, both that CSG at 20 report and the Commission on Parliamentary Reform focused a lot of attention on parliamentary committees. And I think this was because the parliamentary committees in 1999 were designed to be so different from Westminster committees in that they were dual purpose. And by that I mean that they undertook both legislative and inquiry work. And for the first few years they were seen to be they were described as a jewel in the Parliament's crown, and they were seen to be a bulwark against any argument that there should be a second revising chamber in the Scottish Parliament. So this dual purpose was designed to be a strength, but I think the reality has highlighted a number of weaknesses. One of those weaknesses I think we hear a lot about is excessive whipping. Whipping you expect, a bit more on legislative matters. No government likes to lose anything in relation to legislation, but that whipping has extended into inquiry work. We've also seen committees' legislative work squeezing out any work that it wants to initiate on its own. There's been a lack of time for really meaningful post-legislative scrutiny, and there's been a really high turnover in membership of committees. When the CSG reported it expected parliamentary committees to allow its members to build up expertise over the course of a whole session, that just hasn't happened. One current example I would give you is the SPPA committee that I've referred to, the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. It's a 5-member committee. It's already had 19 members sit on that committee, and only the convener has been there since the beginning of the session. That just completely cuts across any notion that people can sit on committees over a period of time and build up any expertise. So what's maybe a bit disheartening to notice at this juncture is that many of those messages have been repeated in the report that the SPPA committee published last month in relation to strengthening committees' effectiveness. However, while that's disheartening, I do think that they've done a very good job in coming up with a series of recommendations to meet those challenges. I can't do justice to the content of that committee report and the work that's done, but a few things that I would highlight. It's looked at culture in parliamentary committees, and it's talked a lot about the importance of collegiate working, how that should be encouraged, and that normally party allegiances should be left at the committee door and committees should follow the evidence in its view. And that's to ensure that they have a common sense of purpose and a clearly defined role. The committee was also clear that in following the evidence, smaller committees were much more effective than larger committees. We've had some difficulties with some larger committees and just how much that can slow down their ability to fulfil their roles. Linking into what I said earlier about the gender-sensitive audit, that committee's report also contains the gender-sensitive audit's recommendations as they relate to parliamentary committees. And the main thing here being is that they're very clear that there should no longer be the ability for any single-sex committees. I think in this day and age that should be an obvious thing, but there's nothing at the moment to prevent that. And even as recently as this session, we have had a few examples of parliamentary committees that consist of only one sex, and it's usually men that sit round about that single-sex committee table. And I have to say, one of those committees this session has been the Public Petitions Committee, which is our main committee in relation to engaging with members of the public, and I'm not sure what it says to people that come in to engage with that committee to see only men sitting in front of them. So hopefully that will now be a thing of the past. In relation to committee conveners, there's long been a call for committee conveners to be directly elected by the whole Parliament rather than through the committee on which those conveners sit, with a view to strengthening and further legitimising that convener role and making sure that it's an alternative ambition for elected members rather than those that are members of the governing party of the day seeing it as maybe a stepping stone into a ministerial office in due course. So the committee's come up with a way in which that might be done. The Welsh Senate is moving in that direction as well, so I think we're looking at how they're doing things, and there may be a consensus that that's something that we can replicate in Scotland. One of the other themes that emerged was committees struggling with a large referred workload, so things that are sent to them by the government, whether that's legislation or other work. In some ways, I think this is, to a certain extent, unavoidable. I think members recognise that the government of the day have the right to deliver on their mandate, but looking at ways that that can be mitigated, the committee's come up with recommendations about committees being able to sit in private while the chamber is sitting. At the moment, our committees don't have that ability to sit while the chamber is sitting in plenary session, so just building a bit more flexibility and a bit more capacity into this, the current way of working. Committee talked a lot about participation and engagement, but I'll come to that later. So at the moment, those are only the committee's recommendations. Next, they have to be debated and considered by the whole Parliament, but that's something that's going to happen this week. So on Thursday, the Parliament will go through these and have a full debate on a parliamentary motion about whether to agree to these. And if the Parliament does so, I think we can expect to see these changes in place for the start of the new session. So while I wouldn't accept all of the criticisms that have been levelled at our parliamentary committees over the years, I think it's really pleasing to see that the committee has taken this course of action, and that if those recommendations are agreed to, we'll see concrete and significant action and changes. So that's some of the practical nuts and bolts developments and changes that we've seen since Donald Dewar talked about there being a new voice in the land. I'd now like to address how the Parliament has met Donald's aspirations about the Parliament being the forum for looking at big ideas. Parliament's strategic plan identifies the Parliament's purpose as representing the people of Scotland by debating issues of national importance, passing legislation and holding the Scottish Government to account. Now, those last two items should be pretty self-evident, but what about that first one, debating issues of national importance? In proposing that programme for government in the first coalition government in May of 1999, Donald Dewar said, "We want to make this Parliament what it can be, the democratic crucible in which we can test our ideas, seek new inspiration and stand to account on our record." So have our ideas been tested? Parliament's rules, as you may well know, allow it to debate issues on any matter, whether that's reserved or devolved. But the Parliament has faced criticism over the years in spending too much time on things that are of little importance or issues that it can't do anything about in a policy or legislative sense. But I think there have been some big ideas developed and debated in the Parliament over the years. From the Parliament's very first session, I would probably pick out land reform. This is an ever-evolving picture, and a new land reform bill is going through the Parliament at the moment. I mean, literally, as I speak, the Parliament is debating a land reform bill. But the first Land Reform Act that was passed in 2003 established a right of public access to most land and inland water in Scotland. And Donald Dewar said at the time of announcing that first reform measure, who would imagine that such a land reform bill, such a land reform bill passing unscathed through the massed ranks of the House of Lords? This is a Scottish solution to a distinct Scottish problem and is now the responsibility of this Parliament. When we were still a very young institution, Scotland led the way in the UK in relation to banning smoking in public places in 2006. This is a thing that I think we all take for granted now, but there was, during the passage of that bill, a lot of opposition, concerns expressed, particularly by the licensing trade. But in general, I think we can say that these fears haven't been realised, and we can see clear, positive public health outcomes as a result. The ban has been associated with improvements in the respiratory health of bar workers, a reduction in hospital admissions for acute coronary syndrome, and a reduction in childhood hospital admissions for asthma. Going on, although all of the nations in the UK considered the reforms to equal marriage at a similar time, with the Scottish Parliament passing that legislation in 2014, as well as a superb debate that day, I think I'll always remember the high level of emotion in the public gallery, which was packed as the bill went through its final stages. I also remember the presiding officer at the time being in tears as she announced that the bill had passed overwhelmingly. And I think it did feel as if Scotland was making a big statement about the kind of country it wanted to be. Going back to the public health area, possibly still a bit more controversial than the smoking ban, we've had the minimum unit pricing for alcohol. I think it's worth remembering that Scotland was the first place in the world to implement such a ban. Because it was unique, evaluation was built in from the start. And the findings of that evaluation have claimed that the policy has led to a 3% reduction in alcohol consumption at a population level, and has also reduced deaths directly caused by alcohol consumption and hospital admissions. Bringing us right up to date, assisted dying is back on the agenda. Today in the Parliament, in the committee this morning, we had the first day of the assisted dying bill at stage 2. This is the first time a bill on assisted dying has got to stage 2. We've had 2 previous attempts to legislate in this area. They've both fallen at stage 1. So the Parliament has moved on to the next stage. No guarantees that this measure will reach the statute book, of course, but it's a development in where we've been in the past. And going back to what I said earlier about extensive whipping and lots of legislative matters, this is one of those issues in which the parties take a step back and allow members to act on conscience. We often hear people saying that this is when the Parliament acts at its best, when we get that personal, heartfelt speeches from across the chamber, regardless of party, members grappling with these big issues and big decisions as legislators and not as party representatives. So I think some of these big ideas can be seen as major successes for the Parliament, but in other areas, big ideas have proven quite difficult to implement. Earlier this year, the Parliament passed the Care Reform Bill, but that bill started life a full 3 years earlier as the National Care Service Bill, which was hailed on introduction as containing the biggest reform to health and social care since the National Health Service Acts of the 1940s. Through the parliamentary process, all of the intended structural reforms were removed, So I think it's quite interesting to reflect on this. Is this a failure of process? Is it a failure of government? Or is it a result of close, considered parliamentary scrutiny, examining legislative proposals and finding them wanting? And of course, the biggest idea of all in Scottish politics terms, and one that's dominated the debate in many ways for over a decade now, is the question of whether Scotland should be an independent country. I think whatever side of the debate you were on and are still on, there is no denying that this was the one time when it felt like the Parliament was discussing and debating something that mattered to everyone in the country. There was a huge public involvement, record turnout for an electoral event in Scotland. The civic engagement round about the referendum was one factor that led on a road to the final big theme I want to talk about, and that links back to a number of our founding principles and its engagement with the people of Scotland. So the Parliament has picked up the challenges that have been set by the Commission on Parliamentary Reform in 2017 and the CSG review in 2019 to create more deliberative ways for the people of Scotland to participate in its work. The CSG at 20's report was clear that of the 4 founding principles, the Parliament had done least well on that first principle, sharing the power, and it concluded that failing to engage meaningfully with citizens can lead to dissatisfaction with democracy and a lack of trust in decision makers. So to that end, the Parliament first created a dedicated committee engagement unit to make the work of the committees more meaningful to the people that the Parliament was there to serve. This was acknowledged and credited by the CSG when it came to look at its report, but it said that more needed to be done. So parliamentary staff became very ambitious and very passionate about this, and we evolved the committee engagement unit into the participation and communities team. At the same time, at an institutional level, the Public Petitions Committee, its remit and title was changed to include civic participation as an explicit responsibility of that committee. The embedding of citizen participation was also included as one of the Parliament's 4 strategic objectives. So the committee, the new Civic Participation and Public Petitions Committee, ran with all of this. It launched a major inquiry which lasted a couple of years. It set up a cross-cutting interdisciplinary team, and it ultimately reported on how the Parliament should engage with people in a different and more complex way. The most high-profile but also complex and influential aspects of this was the use of citizens' panels. I'm not going to go into detail about how citizens' panels are established and how they go about their work, but one thing I would like to highlight is that as well as the formal inputs in terms of feeding into considerations that are being undertaken by parliamentary committees, they have that very important additional benefits to the individuals who are invited to join panels and assist in that work. These are randomly selected people from across Scotland, and often there are people who have never engaged with the Parliament before, would never think of engaging with the Parliament before, think that even if they have particular views, that people sitting in these positions in Edinburgh wouldn't be interested in them. These citizen panels have been quite groundbreaking, transformational for a lot of people, and we have so many glowing testimonials from people that have gone into that process about the positive impact it's had on them and the way they view politics and the political process. I'll quote just one testimonial which says, "I suppose that when I first came into this group, I would have been put in the demographic of people who are ignorant and arrogant about politics, but I then realised that it was not really about politics. You spoke about deliberative democracy. The 19 members came together to discuss the issues in an adult, normal way. None of us was well versed in politics or academia, but we came up with the recommendations 100% as a group. It was amazing that all 19 members agreed our recommendations at the end of the day. The fact that we came up with these recommendations together shows the power of deliberative democracy." So building on all of this work that's happened in this session, the committee has recently proposed a blueprint for embedding this approach into our work, and that has been adopted by the Parliament for the next session. So I'm conscious that I've covered a lot of successes of the Parliament, along with a few areas where we haven't got things quite right. But before I close, I think it's right and proper to highlight where some weaknesses remain and where reform is still required. Firstly, I think the Parliament hasn't addressed the relationship between central and local government in the last 26 years. I think there are always inevitably tensions between the two spheres of government, particularly when they have overlapping responsibilities and one side is reliant on the other for funding. I think if you look at the submissions to the CSG, many referenced this tension, and what is striking is that in the local government sphere there's been a large number of commissions, reviews, legislation, none of which have really done anything to change the structure and funding model for local government. Lots of commentators have talked about disempowerment at the local government level, and there were strong expectations in 1999 that the powers flowing from London to Edinburgh, some of them would flow on to local government, and I think that's failed to happen. Another thing I would highlight is the dominance of short-term thinking to the detriment of proper long-term planning, and I think this affects not just the relationship with local government, but also how policy and politics in general work. I think in some ways, again, this is probably not a huge surprise. It's common to many democracies simply due to that electoral cycle. But I would like to see the Parliament stepping more into that long-term planning sphere and looking beyond just the next election in the next 5 years. We're currently revamping our Futures Forum, which we've had since session 2, just to try and make it more relevant and more accessible to our members who are conducting inquiry work, and just to try and make it a bit more easy for them to think beyond that electoral cycle and make it a bigger feature of the Parliament's work. Again, of major concern to lots of people in public organisations are the declining levels of trust in our institutions. I think this is partly fueled by the rise of mis and disinformation, fake news, and the use and misuse of AI. So I've talked about our strategic change objectives, and we've recently agreed that we're going to propose that this building up of trust is a strategic objective for us in the next session, and I would hope that that would be adopted. And finally, I think it's quite clear the Parliament hasn't yet addressed some of the big policy challenges in Scotland. I think there's lots of work that still needs to be done in relation to educational attainment, child poverty, social deprivation, those big issues. So there's clearly a lot of work still to be done in those and many other areas. So bringing things to a close then, to come back to where I started, the question was, what would Donald Dewar have made of all of that change that I've just talked you through? I think it's fair to say that few people in 1999 would have predicted Brexit and the seismic changes that that has brought. Similarly, some of the financial, demographic, cultural and political changes over the last quarter of a century have been hugely significant. I also think it's fair to say, harking back to 1999, that there were some elements in that Labour government that delivered devolution that were lukewarm in its support. Famously or infamously, George Robertson said in 1999, when the idea of a devolved parliament in Edinburgh was really starting to gain some traction, that devolution would kill nationalism stone dead. Fast forward 20 years, when Tony Blair, the Prime Minister who presided over that transfer of powers from London to Edinburgh, reflecting on devolution over those 20 years, said, "I regard it essentially as a success." That's not exactly damning praise, resounding praise. He went on, "I think people forget that there was a huge amount of pressure for devolution as an alternative to independence, and if we hadn't offered that alternative, you might have had an independent Scotland by now." So it's clear to me at least that there was a strain in Donald Dewar's party that saw devolution as a means to prevent what would have been seen as a greater evil, rather than what Donald said in 1999, that it was not an end, but a means to a greater end. I would contrast those comments of George Robertson and Tony Blair with what Donald said in winding up his 1999 speech. He said, "We are fallible, we will make mistakes, but we will never lose sight of what brought us here, the striving to do right by the people of Scotland, to respect their priorities, to better their lot, and to contribute to their common weal." To respect their priorities, not to try and set them or to limit them, but to adopt them and act upon them. I think Donald Dewar would have seen the Parliament's failings as our collective failings made in Scotland to be addressed by us in Scotland. All of that change that I've referred to over different spheres since 1999, some of that has been initiated by us, some of it was thrust upon us, but all of it has been embraced and implemented. As a Parliament, we haven't stood still, and I think Donald Dewar would have liked that. At the official opening of the Parliament in 1999, he said he looked forward to a time when that day would be seen as a turning point, when democracy was renewed in Scotland. Sadly, he wasn't to survive long enough to enjoy that reflection, but I think if he had, he would have approved. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Fascinating lecture, and I imagine there's probably quite a few questions in the audience. See, I knew I was going to forget the slide. There you go. There's a slide. In case you didn't know, we now have the Q&A section. So, so with that, we'll just go to, I'll not privilege myself. We'll go to John in the back first. And just catch my eye if you have a question.
Here you go, John.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on being both impartial but frank at the same time, which I think was itself demonstrated a certain degree of political skill. Two very quick points. One thing you didn't mention, as but there was widely stated as an ambition for the Parliament, and it was embedded in its timetable, was it was going to have family-friendly hours. Yet we've had a number of particularly female younger politicians with younger children who have felt unable to carry on, of whom, of course, the current Deputy First Minister is a prime example. And the Parliament seems to have found it rather difficult to be able to organise nursery provision within its premises. So I wonder if you'd like to address that particular issue and why the Parliament has seemingly not been as successful on that criterion as might have hoped. Secondly, and just to invite you to look forward a bit, you reference the new boys and girls that you'll be having to look after next May. Quite a lot of them are quite likely to come from a political party with which others may not wish to sup and may not want to deal. And how much of a challenge do you regard maintaining the coherence and work of the Parliament against the possibility that you will have a block of MSPs who the rest of the Parliament will essentially want to shun?
Thank you for both questions. And if I could maybe pick up the second one first, I'm glad that you highlighted my impartiality. So I'm going to have to be very careful with what you say. But I think it doesn't impinge on my impartiality to say that we may be faced with a party that is more sceptic of devolution than we've seen in the past. The Conservative Party pre-1999 wasn't one of the drivers of devolution, but since then they've got on board with it. They have worked with the Parliament and its institutions. So there may well be a challenge coming down our way, and I think the polls are starting to be very consistent that will be the case. As parliamentary officials, we will do what we always do. We'll respect the democratic will of the people of Scotland, so we will provide services in exactly the same way. But I do anticipate that there will be tensions more so between the parties. One of the things, interestingly, that the CSG at 20 mentioned in its report was the surprising amount of convergence there was across all of parties. They highlighted on many social policies there wasn't much that divided the parties, and I think that's probably still been the case. Whether that's the case after May next year, I would very much doubt. So it's something that we're aware of, but my answer to that would be impartiality will guide how we treat that new dynamic. On your first question, yes, it's a bone of contention, and it has been, and I think it will continue to be. Some of the aspirations for that family-friendly approach were baked in at the outset. Our standing orders say that decision time is normally at 5 o'clock each day. Tonight it's going to be 10 o'clock. Tomorrow night it will be at least 7:15, it may be later. 2 days last week it was 10 o'clock. So they're constant issues, and we come up with that tension between being a parliament, considering legislation that it can't be rushed through against the needs of recognising that people have caring responsibilities, whether that's childcare or other responsibilities. Yeah, and I think we will always have this tension unless I think there's been a huge reluctance for the Parliament to look at Mondays and Fridays. They're seen as sacrosanct for members. That's when they do their constituency work. That's when they don't have to be in Edinburgh. But I think not everything can be transacted within the parameters of what we would expect to see in a family-friendly Parliament. You asked about a nursery. That's been something that we've been looking at very, very closely. We had this at the end of last session with women MSPs standing down, citing childcare responsibilities being incompatible with their responsibilities as elected members. We're under the auspices of the Care Commission, the Care Inspectorate rather. There are strict rules about how a nursery operates. We do have a creche. That's limited use for elected members. Being able, yes, as you indicating, being able to access that provision for 3 hours a day doesn't create the opportunities that members need. So it's an ongoing issue. It's under active consideration by the corporate body at the moment, but I'm not optimistic about us being able to resolve that one anytime soon.
Thanks very much for your speech. I'm a member of the public, so I'm not here as a student for the university, or I'm not in a political party either. I was all for devolution, 100%. When it came in, I woke up the next morning thinking there will be change. But I don't see that change. I just see a retreat into a silo which is totally unaccountable, lacks transparency, and a lot of the things you're saying yourself in relation to committees and being whipped in committees. So it says, well, where's the independence in there? And you mentioned something that I thought was very interesting. That was one of your committees had 19 members had to drop out over a period of time. And was that the public appointments committee, did you say?
Yes.
Would that not give you great concern as somebody that was the chief executive of the Parliament and as well as the clerk? That one individual who's been on as a chair and 19 members of that committee have left. Would that not ring, alarm bells? In terms of the public participation groups you're talking about, we've moved on, and you mentioned it yourself. We have got technology. We've all got smartphones. You could say to the public tomorrow on Wednesday, we're going to have a vote in the Parliament on this. What's your public's view on this? Yes or no? It doesn't have to be a referendum. But I did ask for a referendum on assisted suicide, and that was denied because it's going through the Parliament. But what I'm saying is the technology has moved on. The transparency of the Parliament has got worse. It's getting worse. So you're talking about different things, and public participation as if it's something new after 26 years. Talking about the lack of cooperation with local authorities. Basically, the government is, throughout Scotland, as in local authorities and the Scottish Parliament, is standing still. We've never had any devolved powers over Brexit. And any time I hear Brexit, it's just a distraction. But I never heard you mention COVID. And currently we've got the same conditions of COVID operating across councils and across Parliament in relation to public access to the very democracy that we're supposed to be in charge on. So don't take that personally, but if you're going next, as you're moving on, as a clerk and as a chief executive, I expect you to be telling the politicians what they can and what they can't do. There should be no power, there should be no whipping, there should only be the constituencies representative acting for their representatives, for their constituencies. And it's just, and now it's a mirror of Westminster. It is what it was supposed to replace. So
I'm going to have to get you to speak. Sorry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. I wish I did have some of the powers that you would like me to have. A number of issues in there. In general, you asked the question about basically has devolution been worth it? As an impartial public servant, it's not for me to answer that question. Lots of proponents and supporters of devolution would point to the fact that it was rare for more than one or two pieces of Scottish-specific legislation to pass through the Westminster Parliament, in contrast to the number of pieces of legislation that can be put through in Edinburgh. But some of the downsides that you have mentioned are ones that I do recognise. Whipping in committees to the extent that we've seen, I think, is a matter of regret. The responsibility there lies with political parties. I think political parties are driven by successes and failures. So much rides on who's up, who's down, that kind of thing. And that drives a lot of the attitude that leads to whipping committees. You mentioned the turnover in committee membership. That is something that does really concern me. I mean, I gave you one example. It's quite a stark example, but I doubt very much if there's a single one of our current 15, 16 committees that haven't had pretty high levels of turnover since the last election. These, again, are decisions of political parties. They put people on committees, they move them off. They might have drivers in terms of freshening up their spokespeople on different policy issues, and that will drive them to make changes in who represents them on committees. You mentioned technology being a tool, as well as the formal citizens panels that are referred to, which are very time consuming and resource consuming. We do use a number of tools that allow committees to have that direct engagement with people, a number of specific pieces of technology that allow people to be brought together in an online sense and to discuss and debate and come to recommendations to meet to parliamentary committees and to individual members. I think there's maybe something else that you picked up on there, but I hope that that's covered the bulk of the issues that you raised.
Thank you. Really fascinating. I think Professor Curtis is right. It pains me as it does to say that there are things that Westminster does better than the current structures of the Scottish Parliament. And I think it comes, there's a few things. The parallel Westminster Hall debating system, the fact, as you said, that committees can meet in parallel at the same time. The issue of payment for select committee chairs as well as them being independently elected. But I think it comes down to a question of capacity. Given the changes and the increase in power and the increasing challenges that the Parliament is facing, is 129 enough?
I think I'm going to be controversial here and give you my strong opinion, which is it's not. The CSG at 20, they addressed this issue and they came to the conclusion that it wasn't either. But it's one of those issues that certainly no serving politician could really make that case. General public doesn't like money being spent on politicians. The idea of more politicians and everything that goes with that is complete anathema to the public. I think a lot of people are driven by what they see and what their opinions are of the Parliament and how it operates. I think what they don't see is the burdens on individual members. I think whatever you think of them in terms of the performance, one thing I see behind the scenes is the demands on their time right throughout the week. I've talked a lot, obviously, about the parliamentary role, but alongside that, they have representative roles, they have party roles. They're often at events and conferences over weekends. Anything happens in their local area, a local fete, the school or whatever, they're at that. We ask a lot of them as well in terms of not just their committee and parliamentary work, but engaging with members of the public. They're spread quite thinly, and when you take out 20 or so members to be government ministers, again, that puts increased pressure on the numbers that are left. So I might not say it again outside this room, but I think there's a strong case for 129 not being enough. You'll know that in Cardiff, at the next election, they'll go from 60 members at present to 96, a really big significant shift. So they've managed to put that through with the consent so far of the Welsh people. So I think there's lessons there about how you would build a case for that happening. I think when you look at the constitutional change I talked about earlier, the 2012 Scotland Act, the 2016 Scotland Act, the responsibilities that came back from Brussels, there's a logical case that the 129 members, what they were asked to do in 1999 is utterly different from what our current 129 members have to deliver. And to me, I think there's a strong logic to say, do we have enough politicians to deliver on that?
Is there enough in the chamber?
At present, no. We have 131 seats in the chamber, but I think it's designed, especially in the front three rows where there's lots of space round about that, so it would take a building project, but not, the chamber itself has got the capacity for more members to be accommodated within it, yes.
You can feel the internal eye roll in the room when you say building project.
Yeah. Maybe that was the wrong phrase. A slight readjustment.
I'm going to press my privilege here for just 1 second and push you a little bit on participation.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, of the founding principles, openness, transparency, accessibility, bringing the public into the Parliament was a crucial element of the institutions, the sort of pick and mix element of bringing together these different institutional types to bring in the Parliament. So you won't be surprised, I'm going to get to the petitions committee, but then also the cross-party groups, having public members and all them.
Yeah.
Has the promise of these participatory mechanisms really been realized? Because if you look at, say, surveys, people don't know that they can actually submit a petition to the Scottish Parliament and that there is a petitions committee that will do something with it. People don't know about the cross-party groups. People don't know about many of these participatory mechanisms. So public awareness is relatively low. How effective would you say that these have been, and is there anything that can be done?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we haven't met those aspirations. And I think the Parliament in recent years has picked up that challenge. I think the Commission on Parliamentary Reform shone a light on this for us, but we haven't just ignored that and said, that's the way things are. We've really tried to have that fundamental shift in how we do it. We talk a lot more about deliberative democracy than we did in the past. I think there's a tension here between members and their representative roles and that more direct form of democracy, and I would stress that we're not trying to do away with the representative role, we're trying to enhance all of that rather than say that this is the be-all and end-all. And I think in the early days it was noticeable that lots of members felt a bit challenged when we started talking about that direct engagement with individuals and groups in their communities. They were saying to us, that's what I do, that's what brought me here. But I think once they got more used to that, they actually saw the benefits of us organising people round the table or in a virtual setting for them to come and have that direct interaction with. And one of the important things I think about those more deliberative aspects is that it's not just a one-off. For the early years, the Parliament's engagement with people were very much, we're doing an inquiry on this, or we've got a bill on that. What do you think? Thanks very much. And that was it. These more deliberative events involve people spending a bit of time with us, having things fed back to them, shared draft reports shared with them, the ability to comment on that, and working that up into a thoroughgoing proposal. So we haven't cracked that by any means yet, but I think the blueprint that we have agreed to pursue in Session 7, we should see a step change again about that just being embedded into our ways of working.
Fantastic. Then maybe right here.
Thank you. I get good example of how check and balances system with a citizen is could happen in Scottish. And I want to know, as far as I know, policies proposed by Scottish government must be approved by the Parliament of Scottish. But is there any happen when the government have any kind of regulation, but the Scottish Parliament suggests to another recommendation policies, like in Indonesia, when the Ministry of Education want to stop the recruitment of the teachers, and they want to allocate their budget to build schools, but the parliaments of Indonesia keep asking for recruiting the teachers as well. Is there any happen in Scottish as well?
I don't think in that particular policy area, but
Yeah.
sorry.
I mean, in Scottish, is ever happened when the Scottish government want to make a policy, but the Parliament suggests to another policy instead?
Yes, that's been a feature over the years, and some of the times that the government has been in minority are times when the government can't push through its proposals, its policy agendas, its legislation. So either has to rethink them, or it has to work with opposition parties in order to be able to get something through the Parliament. And there's plenty of examples of that having happened. So the Parliament is the body which would ratify policy changes by the government, especially if they're done in a legislative sense. So the government can't act without that parliamentary authority.
So you mentioned one, oh yeah, thank you. You mentioned one of the challenges, kind of unfinished business, is improving the sort of interaction, the relationship between the Scottish Parliament and local government. I wonder if you might say a little about, what might be the art of the possible there. I'm minded of the previous question that led to the answer that we need more politicians for the Scottish Parliament. So, is there a sense in which the country could do with removing a level and just restructuring more dramatically in that way?
I think that's quite a big question for me in terms of the levels of government. But I think we have seen some developments in the relationship between the centre and the local government spheres. Most recently with the Verity House agreement between COSLA and the Scottish Government. And there has been a reduction in the amount of ring fencing that the central government has imposed on local government. So I think those are things that would point to that are an example of things that can and should be done. The whole question of local government reform, people always hark back to the most recent reforms, which are quite a long time ago now, as being so massive and so time consuming and so huge in their effect that they just don't want to go there again. So the commissions that I've mentioned earlier, they tend not to even lift the lid on all of that. And it's something that I think at some point somebody's going to have to be bold enough to say, is this something that we need to look at again? People talk about the rationalisation of the police service in Scotland. Yeah. I mean, that's on a tiny scale compared to local government. But there are parallels there about having that unitary police authority in Scotland. Are some of the financial benefits, at least, that have been driven through that, are they available in the local government sphere? I'll leave that as a question rather than try to answer it, if you don't mind. But I think there's lots of work to be done there, yes.
Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. I wanted to pick up, obviously we've talked a couple of times about the Senedd reform that's gone through. One of the other things they did was to drop AMS as the electoral system. I'm slightly interested in what you thought, whether you think that's a good idea for Scotland, but more that whether you still see a difference between how the constituency and the list MSPs work in the Parliament after 26 years.
Really good question. In terms of the services that we provide as officials, we don't treat list members any differently from first past the post members, from constituency members. But I do know there's quite often tension between the two. We're seeing at the moment people who are currently list members who have aspirations to win a constituency, they start to encroach in that area. We see list members are obliged to operate in at least 2 constituencies within the wider region, and we quite often see complaints starting to come in at this stage in an electoral cycle that that's not happening because they're after that constituency. So I think that's one area where we see those tensions arising. I think also that we quite often hear members saying that their workload, their caseload as a constituency member is way higher than it is for a list member. And I've heard people who have been both saying that if they've moved from being a list member to a constituency member, their caseload has gone through the roof compared to what they had before, and the other way, the caseload falls off the other end. So that tells you that constituents will go to their constituency member. I don't think they'll sit down with their 7 or 8 representatives and pick one necessarily. They'll think, that's the person for my constituency, I'll go to them. So I think that has to be recognised. In terms of whether we move away from that system, again, probably not for me to say. I think we've had lots of benefits in Scotland for there being an element of proportional representation. Whether we would ever move to the Wales kind of all-country system, I'm not quite sure. I think politicians like to have an element of that connection between them and their constituents, which you just can't have if you represent a vast area like the Highlands and Islands or the northeast of Scotland. So there's no groundswell of opinion emerging, in my view, in relation to the electoral system. But I think we could probably do more to recognise the differences that members experience if they're a constituency member as opposed to a regional member.
So as these things tend to go, suddenly all the hands go up when we have 5 minutes left. So we'll do our best to get around, but just be mindful of the length of your questions, if you will.
Okay, thanks very much. You outlined the principles right at the start about accountability, accessibility, inclusivity. One principle that was missing was subsidiarity. You mentioned at the start the aspirations that there had been discussed about devolution to the Scottish Parliament being the start of further devolution within Scotland. You mentioned as a future challenge the relationship with local government, and you picked up on that just now. But surely there's a much wider issue about subsidiarity down to the local level. I can't think of another country in Europe that has such lack of self-government at the local level. We have towns of 20, 30, 50,000 people with no self-government, let alone smaller communities. And whenever, for example, the issue of strengthening community councils or some other self-government level has been discussed, local authorities have been strongly against any kind of devolution below the local government level. With respect to the points you were making about connectivity with the citizen and some of the crises, do you not see that is an issue, a bigger issue than the relations just with local government?
Yeah, thank you. Subsidiarity has never been a founding principle of the Parliament, but you make some very, very good points, and I have heard it said that Scotland, the UK as a whole, are amongst the most centralised countries in the world. And I have to be honest and say sometimes I sit in the chamber and I hear questions being put to ministers and I think to myself, why on earth is that a question for a minister? Is it something to do with a local library or whatever? So I think there's a very strong case to look at where responsibilities lie. And I think you make a really good point of that below local authority level. Some of our local authorities cover huge areas and are responsible for huge numbers of our citizens. What happens below that at community level? So I don't have any answers for you, but I think you do make some very good points.
Here, and then we have 2 more over here, and then that's going to be what we have time for, I think.
Thank you very much for that. Something we've touched on a few times briefly, but is there merit in a German-style system where whipping is prohibited? And that maybe that the answer is different for committees and in the chamber more generally. And secondly, considering the pressure on parliamentary time, do maiden speeches pass a cost-benefit analysis?
Very good questions. Outlawing whipping is a really interesting idea. I think in terms of our political culture in the UK as a whole, it's not something that I would anticipate ever happening. I think when we see inappropriate use or excessive use of it, I think we can call it out more, shine a light on it more. I think that's probably the best way to challenge it. Your second point, sorry, yes, we don't specifically have maiden speeches in the Scottish Parliament in the way that Westminster does, but we do recognise when a new member is making that speech. In Westminster, my understanding is that members can get up in the middle of a debate and speak about anything. We expect our members to speak on the issue at hand. They may start off their speech with a thanks to their constituents, talk a bit about themselves, but we do expect that for them to draw their marks to the relevance of the point that's under consideration. So we're probably slightly above Westminster in terms of that cost-benefit analysis.
Thank you very much for that, David. It was very thought-provoking, very comprehensive and certainly very impartial. I have a question more around the manageability of the Parliament from a kind of practical level from you as a CEO. And that is, we have talked here about Cardiff, we have talked about Westminster, which I'm not entirely sure is a good reference point in terms of scale, because it's much bigger. But have we, or should we, look at what's happened in some of the Nordic countries, or in Dublin, or Belfast? Because some of the challenges that you raise, I'd be surprised if they haven't happened elsewhere in some of the newer or less mature political institutions. So has it been on your mind to go and see what's on in Oslo and Copenhagen and Dublin?
Yeah, I was over in Stockholm recently, a Nordic city that you didn't mention there. I think in the early days of the Parliament, when the officials first came together before politicians joined us, a group of people, I wasn't one of them, went off to the Nordic countries to examine how their parliaments operated. And the thinking there was similar size of populations, similar responsibilities, cultural connections as well. And we've talked a few times over the years about renewing that and doing it again, but we've never quite got round to it. One of the things that I was looking at when I was over in Stockholm was about how responsive its parliament is to emerging events, because that was something that we were trying to build a bit of momentum on. And they have mechanisms in their chamber which do allow members to get up at particular times with no notice to raise issues and to have a government minister respond to it. So I think there's some really good learning in the Nordic countries. And given that you've asked me that, I think I'll go back and just ask for a bit of funding to take myself off, to do some proper research.
Hi, David. Thanks for a really interesting talk and subsequent grilling afterwards. I was born about 9 months before the Scottish Parliament was founded, so it's always felt like a sort of part of my life going through around about the same time. I know that 2 weeks after I turned 16, I voted in the Scottish independence referendum, so there'd always been sort of interesting milestones following through. So what I was thinking was, for people maybe 10 years younger than me, who are growing up sort of in the 2020s, what is it that is exciting about the Scottish Parliament of today, and what is it that you're doing to engage them?
God, that's a real challenge. When I talked earlier on about there being a new voice in the land and it's still feeling like that, I knew there would be somebody that has never known that new voice not being in existence. I do think some of the stuff I've talked about in relation to engagement and participation is quite exciting. I think we're trying to transform. It's not just a kind of set piece evolution of what we do. We're really trying to transform things, and we really want people to be brought into the political process. So I think that's one thing that I would encourage people of your generation to have a look at. I know there's a lot of cynicism about politics and how staid it can seem to be, but I think we are doing quite a lot of good work in this area, so that's something that I would encourage you to have a good look at, and I'm happy to talk to you afterwards about some of those opportunities if that would be helpful.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I will be strongly admonished if I don't put the other slide up. To remind you that coming up on the 21st of November, we're going to try an experiment, which is a live recording of the Bernard Ponsonby and Alex Massey podcast, the best podcast on Scottish politics going, obviously. So we're going to do a live recording of that here at the university, so please do sign up to join us for that. But with that, I will turn and thank David McGill. Thank you very much for a very informative lecture. We often think of parliaments as the people who are elected to serve in them, and sort of forget that these are institutions, and the institution matters for how those representatives are able to actually function as representatives of their constituents. So thank you very much for a very engaging lecture.
Thank you.